George Bronwyn here. Please come in.
Can I do a photo? Thank you, sweetheart. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Here, I can take it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Good evening, Senator, members of the CCF, distinguished guests. It is truly an honor to be the recipient of this inaugural award named after our first Prime Minister, John A., Mr. Canada, who will withstand history no matter how many streets named after him are renamed and how many statues are removed. It's unlikely that those who vandalize his statues would know that none other than Pierre Trudeau regarded himself as, quote, a John A. Macdonald conservative at heart. No doubt, Mr. Trudeau also admired Sir Georges-Étienne Cartier, the other namesake of this amazing award, who, like his boss, Macdonald, was a great railway builder, nation builder, a literal uniter, a once fils de la liberté, son of liberty, who took on the crown, took on the Chateau clique, forerunners of the Laurentian elite, but went on to serve as Canada's first Minister of Defence and convinced French Canada that the province of Quebec belonged in Confederation. So, hats off to the pragmatic patriots, Sir John A. and Sir Cartier. I want, of course, to thank everyone at the CCF for this award, which I learned of one day last fall on an email out of the blue. For a post-politician still working out exactly what to do next, it made my day. Lovely, too, to be at this historic club with its proud conservative affiliation. I'm in the right place. Law Society codes of conduct prescribe that lawyers should always encourage public respect for the administration of justice, but at the same time, quote, try to improve it, never hesitate to speak out against injustice, and above all, commit to equal justice within an impartial system. But of course, that's also where the nuances come in. For example, John Crosbie's notion of injustice was doubtless different from Jody Wilson-Raybell's, or, for that matter, from Alan Blakeney's, all outspoken, even activist justice ministers. After the Boushie case, Wilson-Raybould curtailed peremptory jury challenges. After the Gomeshi case, she sought greater defense-side disclosure in sex assault cases to defang perceived gotcha cross-examination of complainants. John Crosbie appointed more women to the bench than anyone else. He was staunchly pro-choice, but he also called Sheila Copps baby. Blakeney was a great defender of the Charter and its notwithstanding clause, but in great part because he, and later his Justice Minister, Roy Romano, considered that constitutional package a protection against the elites. Romano was initially a Charter skeptic. One reviewer wrote about his book, Canada Notwithstanding, that traditionally, quote, the populist socialist view was that the courts were elitist citadels of privilege, which were not to be trusted, and in fact could make up, in Romano's words, part of a majoritarian tyranny. So, what constitutes populism, privilege, equal justice, injustice, depends in great part on your ideological perspective. The law and politics are closely intertwined. Everything is political. But what I would respectfully submit is that now more than ever, it is much harder to be an outspoken or activist, small c conservative justice minister than otherwise. To take on the majoritarian tyranny, the elitist citadels of privilege that now exist, means that civil libertarians must embrace and advocate for their own version of the living tree. And then there's the matter of the delicate dance of politics and the judiciary. Let's not forget Supreme Court Justice Bora Laskin's dictum that, quote, a judge has no freedom of speech to address political issues which have nothing to do with judicial duties. Abstention from political discourse, he said, guarantees impartiality, integrity, and independence, end quote. Perceived judicial activism comes to bear when ideology masquerades as impartiality, when ideology hides behind the great shield or sword of judicial independence, when ideology hides behind the rule of law or the so-called rules-based order. Last month in Davos, Prime Minister Mark Carney channeled former anti-communist freedom fighter Václav Havel, which was awkward, and called for a return to rules-based order. Many loved the speech, including a certain MP from Edmonton. But it was laden with irony. In Canada, in Europe, the rules-based order has come to mean being existentially anti-American, while at the same time being dependent on America for both defense and trade. As Konrad Jakubowski recently wrote, nothing symbolized what Carney himself called the extreme global integration of the old world order more than Davos and the World Economic Forum. For decades, he noted, global elites preached the virtues of this integration, often at the expense of their own workers. This year, and with the advent of Trumpism, they came to mourn the end of an era. Back in Saskatchewan, a now retired judge was well known for his rule of law being eroded speech. But the only places it was apparently being eroded were not in Venezuela or Cuba or China. It was in conservative countries, Hungary, Poland, the US, of course, and in Israel. Speaking of Israel, what really angered those protesting nightly on the streets back in 2023 was that the Netanyahu government was proposing something very similar to Canada's notwithstanding clause, which, depending on your political leanings, is either a savior of parliamentary sovereignty or the nuclear option, a destroyer of the rule of law. In the very name of democracy itself, the federal government wants to limit the application of the notwithstanding clause. And later this month, the Supreme Court may decide the clause's fate, which is ironic in itself. But you get my drift. The rule of law is being eroded. The rule of law is being eroded. We hear that all the time. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Richard Wagner, himself has called for boldness in the face of this erosion. But have you noticed that it's only ever a certain kind of boldness? For example, Wagner called the 2022 convoy anarchy, hostage-taking, forced blows against the state, justice, and democratic institutions, which should be, quote, denounced with force by all figures of power. And now, he is set to preside at the appeal of 2 federal court decisions which ruled against the invocation of the Emergencies Act. If it happens, worthy of recusal, what would Bora Laskin say? Meanwhile, has the rule of law become the rule of lawyers? British Labour peer Lord Glassman thinks yes. He recently wrote that the so-called international rules-based order was achieved not through politics, but the law. It crept up on us. Sovereignty came to lie not in Parliament, but in the courts. Sovereignty came to be subordinated to international treaty law, which was prescribed by unelected armies of bureaucrats. The UN, the EU, lawyers started to determine the acceptable parameters of politics. The problem, as Glassman noted, was that such a view was impossible to sustain because politics is fundamental to how society runs. Brexit, COVID, woke over ideology, immigration, Donald Trump, these were among the big populist game changers that have come to rattle the cage of the globalist rules-based order. Suddenly we remembered, voting matters, parliaments matter. They can and they should actually make policy, pass legislation. It is a sign of desperation in the face of all that rule by lawyers that increasingly in Canada, governments have had to resort to the notwithstanding clause simply to carry out policy. That's crept up on us too. As David Warren wrote in the National Post back in 2003, it is thanks to the unamendable 1982 Constitution that the courts now rule Canada. It took them more than a decade to discover how much power Trudeau's charter has given them and taken away from Parliament. Canada, he wrote, is going to hell in a handcart. And it isn't just any handcart. It's the Charter of Rights, pulled by the ghost of Pierre Trudeau, end quote. Religious symbols, cross-provincial mobility of university graduates, medical transitioning of minors, back-to-work legislation, school choice. These are just some of the areas where the notwithstanding clause has been brought to bear. But Alan Blakeney, father of the Charter, also a constitutional scholar, was very clear that the use of the notwithstanding clause does not amount to what he called a suspension of rights. The clause was intended to ensure that the state could, for, quote, economic or social reasons, or simply because other rights were found to be more important, choose to override a charter-protected right. There would be instances when rights collide, he said, but charter rights are, quote, not more important than other rights. In 1999, Supreme Court Justice Frank Akabuchi said that the notwithstanding clause was welcome because it established, quote, a process of dialogue with the legislatures. How lovely. What happened to dialogue? Dialogue is what in the Morgentaler case, for example, saw Supreme Court Justice Bertha Wilson explicitly serve back to Parliament the responsibility to legislate on the abortion issue. Of course, Parliament is where it remains to this day. Speaking of dialogue, the annual so-called road shows undertaken by Superior Court justices in the name of supposed transparency aren't exactly enhancing it. These usually feature a single sycophantic news conference and carefully choreographed community visit. That's Potemkin Village. But in real communities, trouble is brewing. For example, a recent Léger poll found that a majority of Canadians believe the justice system is working against law-abiding citizens and fueling the feeling, if the law doesn't respect me, why should I respect the law? Who can blame them? A University of Alberta law professor recently called the accusation deeply problematic that some judges are making decisions along, quote, partisan lines. Putting aside that 3/4 of judges have donated to the Liberal Party, or that politicization starts early with slanted cultural competency law society courses and very political positions taken by bar associations. Putting all that aside, the late, great BC Court of Appeal Justice, Mary Southern, once said, quote, "We have known for years that the Charter of Rights would bring political questions into the courts. It was a piece of liberal silliness that we could have done without," she added. Bringing political questions to the courts where they are being decided. Of course it is happening. Judges are using the Charter's Section 7, for example, life, liberty, and security of the person, to empower children to take on the climate policies of the entire province of Ontario, prevent homeless encampments from being dismantled until every unhoused member has found somewhere to live, prevent the removal of bike lanes, and prevent closure of drug consumption sites near preschools. Not political? According to the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, the $25 million federally funded court challenges program has subsidized small L liberal causes 96% of the time. And is it any wonder that there is some sense of erosion out there when bail has become entrenchedly skewed in favor of release? It's right there in the criminal code. Private land ownership in BC and now elsewhere is suddenly in question. A landmark legal decision last year means that Canadian businesses risk lawsuits over nature inaction, but not Parks Canada for letting Jasper burn. More than 700 foreign criminals are at large. Violent crime and extortion are surging. Anti-Semitism is a dirty secret. Police officers returned guns to the Tumbler Ridge shooter despite many red flags. But AI companies are the culprit. As the CCF recently highlighted, a citizen in Windsor, Ontario, was handcuffed, arrested, and charged with trespassing after he held up a sign at a city ice rink that simply read, "Under the Municipal Act, you're required to provide a complete," as in not redacted, "budget." Rule of law? How about the right to free expression or assembly? Time for boldness. When judges do speak up these days, they're usually fretting about Danielle Smith and her comments about how she sometimes wishes she could direct the judiciary instead of having the judiciary direct the government, stop the presses. Alberta Justice Colin Feasby was not amused when, after he'd been asked to review the constitutionality of a referendum question by the province's chief electoral officer, the Alberta government simply introduced a new bill to enable it. Feasby wrote that while the legislature had that right, he had spent a great deal of time, including with Indigenous interveners, reviewing the question, and that the bill was the antithesis of the stable, predictable, and ordered society, I'm quoting, that the rule of law contemplates and democracy demands, end quote, says he. For all the prevailing horror about musings of Danielle Smith's, the counter question should always be, has Quebec ever proposed or done the same? How about effectively bypassing the federal immigration system? It's had in place an economy-based system since 1991. Or using the notwithstanding clause 33 times and counting. And between 1982 and 1985, notwithstanding everything. Or ensuring a roster of Supreme Court justices. Or holding 2 separation votes. How can we say that we live in a united country when there is such a double standard? And while Smith and sometimes Doug Ford are usually the bad guys, what about NDP Premier David Eby, a former prosecutor and EG? He recently lashed out at how judges are destroying the economy, and specifically at the BC Court of Appeal decision that now mandates governments to abide by UNDRIP in all existing legislation. Free, prior, and informed consent. That is tantamount to a veto over major projects in this country. EB said, to face such dramatic, overreaching, and unhelpful court decisions is deeply troubling. He's right. But where was the public, let alone judicial opprobrium, over those remarks? My friends, when I was in government, I was outspoken on the importance of upholding the exclusive constitutional jurisdiction of provinces. The EV regulations, the federal fuel standard, these were egregious infringements of provincial regulation over specific industries. Some have been shelved, the EV regulations, sort of, not the federal fuel standard, aka carbon tax number 2. The oil and gas cap is shelved on paper, although the irrational, unreachable federal methane regulations are still in place, and they are in effect another oil and gas cap by default. And Bill C-69, or the no fossil fuel for power, turn out the lights, federal clean electricity regulations, still very much on the books. Insidious red tape and part of a mentality that is thwarting major projects and investment in our country. Capital flight to the US is off the charts. The bureaucracy, Dominique LeBlanc mused last week, is slowing Canada's ability to boost the economy. You think? For my part, fighting for the outright repeal of economically harmful legislation was my fight, including with the Saskatchewan First Act to uphold the rule of law, constitutionally speaking. I did also try to raise the alarm about UNDRIP. My argument was that provinces couldn't accept Bill C-69, for example, because UNDRIP is baked into it. Same with the benign-sounding roundtables that the federal government was always proposing to provinces, but whose quid pro quo was always adherence to UNDRIP. Same with equivalency agreements and most MOUs. Don't worry, little lady, was the attitude of many colleagues and bureaucrats. It's just a non-binding treaty, until it wasn't. Same with the pronoun case in Saskatchewan and its supposed violation of the Charter's Section 11, cruel and unusual punishment. Think solitary confinement, extreme coercion. I was assured it will never apply to parental consent for unofficial name changes in school for under 16-year-olds, until it looks very likely that it will. Which brings us back to judicial overreach. And of course, in the upholding of impartiality, some judges are brave, are bold. One was Ontario Justice Maria Caroccia, who acquitted the 5 junior hockey players last year. The slogan, "Believe the victim," has no place in a criminal trial, she wrote. To assume that the complainant is telling the truth is the equivalent of imposing a presumption of guilt on the person accused. That is antithetical to the fundamental principles of justice, end quote. Another was Justice Paul Bychuk of the Nunavut Court of Justice, who last year raised the alarm about the effect of the Gladue principle on Indigenous women who are abused or killed by Indigenous men. Far too many reported cases give mere lip service to victims of domestic and sexual violence, he wrote. Colonialism's legacy has affected Inuit women and girls every bit as much as Inuit men. In the United Kingdom, clearly in the throes of debate these days about two-tier justice, a Labour Justice Minister tried to challenge a sentencing council of bureaucrats who were pushing to enshrine special treatment consideration of intergenerational trauma for certain defendants. When the minister tried to buck that, she was accused of threatening the council's independence. Oh, for a notwithstanding clause. My friends, if we take the fundamental precepts about the pursuit of equal justice and improving it and speaking out in its defense, if we take that to heart, we must question, we must criticize, diplomatically but sometimes forcefully, and be bold. There will always be pressure by the Chateau clique, in whatever form, to belong. Be good Canadians, particularly in the West. Respect our betters, toe the line. But as Margaret Thatcher said, God needs no faint hearts for his ambassadors. What John A. called the constitutional spirit demands more, not less, debate. So let's channel Cartier and Macdonald, rebels with a cause. Fils de la liberté, au Canada, mon pays, mes amours. Thank you so much.